for policy and practices. So now let me invite our two distinguished speakers for our opening session. I will start, of course, by the first great speaker, who is Mr. David Achorena, the director of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, UIL. Mr. Achorena will provide an overview of family and intergenerational learning from a lifelong learning perspective, together with main activities of UNESCO. Just a kind reminder to both our speakers for this opening session that we have 7 minutes for each of your intervention. David, the floor is yours. Please.
Merci Hervé. Dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am delighted to welcome you today to the UNESCO webinar on family literacy and indigenous and local learning. For decades, UNESCO has advocated family and intergenerational literacy and learning as part of a holistic approach to lifelong learning. It links 3 major objectives: the well-being of children, parents, and their family members, universal basic education, and the advancement of literacy and numeracy for young people and adults. Intergenerational approaches to learning are not new. In fact, they have always existed and are present in different ways in all countries and cultures. The underpinning principle is based on the oldest educational traditions, learning between generations of family members and communities. Family learning programs combine formal, non-formal, and informal learning and use synergies between the different stakeholders responsible for education. Within that process, adult, early childhood, and primary education and adult education can complement and enrich one another. Different generations learn from and with each other, and since learning is linked to home experience, there are opportunities to practice school learning in the real world in the context of family and community, where local and indigenous knowledges are also imparted. The term family learning implies broader learning activities that go beyond literacy. It refers to any learning activity that contributes to a family culture of learning involving both children and adult family members. The term family literacy and learning can be used to refer to literacy and learning practices within families that promote the development of literacy, numeracy, language, and related life skills. Related learning activities aim for social change in both families and communities. Developing a culture of learning is often the overarching goal of national policies. Family literacy and learning should therefore be approached from a macro level, lifelong and life-wide perspective. Family literacy and family learning offer adults and children the opportunity to become independent, proactive lifelong learners. In addition, they help educational institutions and providers of literacy and learning programs to bring learning and life closer. It is important to emphasize that there is no one-size-fits-all model of family literacy. As indicated in the UL publication on case studies of family learning programs, a variety of policies, strategies, and programs based on different approaches of family and literacy community-based learning can be observed. This diversity exists to different goals and objectives, contexts, target groups, and capacities to provide the services. Each program is tailored to these specific objectives, factors, and circumstances. More importantly, as observed in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, families were expected to support children's remote learning when schools were closed. Despite many challenges, the family and intergenerational learning approach contributed to ensuring the learning continuity. This webinar also provides an opportunity to explore the benefits of indigenous and local learning approaches to family literacy and intergenerational learning. The most recent report from the International Commission on the Futures of Education, entitled Reimagining Our Futures Together, New Social Contract for Education, recognizes the importance of shared knowledge grounded on a rich human heritage and shaped by knowledge that connects different generations, passes on cultural heritage, and makes room for review and update. The indigenous approach to family literacy are a building block for enhancing shared knowledge in our efforts to build more inclusive, pluralistic societies. Moreover, I believe that the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which will be launched next year, will allow us to deepen our reflection on the meaningful connections between indigenous language, literacy, intergenerational learning, and indigenous knowledge systems, cultures, and ways of knowing. Pour terminer, je voudrais maintenant souligner quelques informations sur la façon dont l'UNESCO promeut l'apprentissage familial et intergénérationnel comme une voie également pour parvenir à la réalisation de l'ODD 4. Depuis plus de 10 ans maintenant, l'Institut de l'UNESCO pour l'apprentissage tout au long de la vie, l'UIL, développe des activités pour appuyer au plan technique un certain nombre de pays pour mettre en place ces programmes d'alphabétisation et d'apprentissage familial, notamment au Mexique, au Mozambique, à Timor-Leste et en Allemagne. Donc nous avons eu déjà, je dirais, une expérience très riche, comme vous le voyez, dans une grande diversité de contextes où ces approches ont pu être testées dans des environnements linguistiques, économiques, culturels très différents. Depuis l'année 2017, avec l'appui du ministère des Affaires étrangères de l'Allemagne, nous avons poursuivi ce travail, notamment en Afrique subsaharienne et en Asie du Sud, deux régions, vous le savez, qui concentrent la majorité de la population analphabète. Et nous avons, au-delà des actions au niveau national, également réalisé des actions de renforcement des capacités au niveau sous-régional. Je voudrais souligner le rôle important de la recherche pour renforcer et améliorer l'efficacité de nos actions et en particulier pour examiner comment, à travers ces programmes, il est possible d'articuler de manière cohérente différents agendas, différentes perspectives, que ce soit non seulement l'information, l'alphabétisation, mais également l'éducation au climat, à la santé, à la protection de l'environnement, qui sont bien sûr des objectifs centraux pour non seulement le DD4, mais l'ensemble de l'agenda pour le développement durable. Je voudrais donc, pour terminer, souligner vraiment que ces approches d'alphabétisation et d'apprentissage intergénérationnel et familial constituent une voie privilégiée pour promouvoir l'éducation et l'apprentissage tout au long de la vie. Et je crois que c'est une ressource qui a été peut-être négligée. Et grâce au partenariat que nous avons développé et à l'engagement des États membres, je pense que nous pourrons à l'avenir promouvoir davantage.
We will be able to do more to promote this approach so as to put into place a real lifelong learning culture.
Ce webinaire sera particulièrement intéressant, stimulant. J'espère que nous pourrons identifier des approches nouvelles et je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous des échanges fructueux. Encore merci pour votre participation, votre engagement.
Lively exchanges. Once again, thank you very much for your commitment and your contribution to promoting these innovative approaches, which are so very necessary and so effective in promoting lifelong learning. Thank you very much, Hervé. Thank you, David, for those encouraging words regarding the topics which bring us together here today, but also the link with SDG 4 at the very least in the framework of lifelong learning. And thank you for having highlighted the way in which UNESCO has already supported these topics and intends to continue to do so in the future.
Switch to English again. And now I have the pleasure to introduce the second speaker, who is Mrs. Rachel Hinton, who is a Senior Social Development Advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO. Mrs. Hinton will reflect on the role of educational research for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Mrs. Hinton, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a great honor and pleasure to be here speaking about the importance of evidence in achieving the SDGs. And I'd like to just briefly take you to the state of Tamil Nadu in India. And imagine your district officer there, sitting behind a desk, crowded with research and study documents. And although he has established structures and trained staff, learning levels still remain very low. And yet he wants to use those resources wisely. And so he accepts many offers of support from civil society and donors. I'll just let the clock chime, a British tradition, apologies. So in fact, he actually has 34 different interventions operating in his office with administrative and technical staff. And yet he doesn't know which of them have the greatest impact, nor the cost data that he needs. And so the research is even more needed in the current context where the space is crowded with differing views of what makes a difference. So if we do want education to be this potent driver of development, then we need evidence more than ever. And we all know that education can boost earnings, it promotes longer and healthier lives, it makes institutions and public services work better, and it is critical to resilience and stability of society more generally. And adults' literacy as part of that is absolutely crucial, both in that sense, but also in the sense of the role they can play in supporting the next generation of literate learners through support to their children. Next slide, please. So how can we use evidence? How all the work that you've all been doing to generate new evidence, how do we ensure that it does make a difference to policy? Now, there's a fantastic initiative called the Impact Initiative that's being led by IDS and Cambridge University Real Centre, looking at these issues. And they have come up with this framework, talking about 4 different types of way you can use your evidence. One, of course, is an instrumental way where you try and change policies and practices in country. But the other important way is through building networks and connectivity, both across communities and between academics and policymakers. The other is capacity building, and that is hugely needed in many of the countries we're working to strengthen research capacity and government's own ability to assess that evidence. If you look at the Building Evidence in Education website under the World Bank, you'll find some great documents that some of your participants here today have been involved with, including one called How to Assess the Strength of Evidence. And finally, conceptually, we can think about changing ways of thinking and contributing to knowledge. And I would argue that much of what you're doing in this unit is conceptual shifts as well, understanding how significant intergenerational literacy is to foundational learning as a whole. Next slide, please. However, there are a lot of barriers to research being used, and I've listed some of them here. But part of the challenge, there are a lack of incentives for the communities of academics to link in with the policymakers. And I hope that in the discussions today, we'll hear some of the ways in which you've been doing that as a research community. Next slide, please. So I think we also know that how we communicate matters greatly, and research is often not communicated in ways that make it accessible to those who need to use that. And I think a lot of progress has been made in recent years around being more creative, using data visualizations, using blogs, using WhatsApp groups, using media stories, and podcasts and so on, and thinking very carefully about how to get the research we've done out in the broadest possible way. Next slide. Because I argue that if we really want your evidence to have an impact and to make a difference to those global goals, then we'll also need to take to scale what you're doing at a local level. And I wanted to just flag an interesting initiative by the Brookings Institute, where they've taken 10 different interventions and looked at how they've gone to scale in education. These are general education initiatives, not about specifically on adult literacy. But the challenges of government scaling good work is quite a significant one. And so again, there's a very interesting report just out last week, an interim report, and it has some really helpful issues, particularly around the enabling environment and how you create that supportive policy and community environment for initiatives to go to scale. And next slide, please. This is just a, so you can see the impact initiative and where you can go to on the website there to find out more about what the Impact Lab are doing and some of the stories that they have available. And finally, the last slide, please. I wanted to share with you an opportunity to reach out to any of these people that you see here on this slide. This, for the first time ever, the education sector, thanks also to collaboration with UNESCO and IIEP and UNICEF and the World Bank, we have for the first time a global education evidence advisory panel. And their role is to help communicate and synthesize evidence of what works in usable ways. And they launched the first Smart Buys report last year, but they will be producing a series of reports. And as a community, you may wish to think about whether you would want a report that they endorse on your area of work on adult literacy. It's the first time ever we've had a global panel in education with Nobel Prize winners. And it's wonderful to have this kind of seniority of academics across the disciplines, from economists, but also qualitative researchers, people who do participant observation, dear to my heart as an anthropologist myself. So a range of disciplines coming together to share best practice. So please do reach out to any of these individuals to get your research and this topic that's so important more widely communicated. And thank you very much, Hervé, for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Many thanks to you, Rachel, for this very informative and insightful information and your intervention. Also for your passion in this process and on the thematic. And thanks to both David and you, Rachel. I think the scene has been very well set. And without delays, let me introduce all of us to the next session. So I close the opening session, and we will move to the next session, which is the session 1, related to global policy and research perspective on family literacy and intergenerational learning. And for this session, I would like to invite the moderator of this session 1, who is my colleague from the section at UNESCO headquarters, Mrs. Marie Yasunaga, who is a program specialist on literacy, as you well know. And I invite you, Marie, to take now the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Alve. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to session 1, Global Policy and Research Perspectives on Family Literacy and Intergenerational Learning. This session intends to explore the role and potential of family literacy and intergenerational learning from global perspectives through 2 presentations. After the presentation, there'll be opportunities for you to express your views through the poll and the discussion. If you have questions or comments, you can also post them in the Q&A section of the Zoom platform. In doing so, please indicate a country and your affiliation, and to whom your question is addressed, if relevant. And we will try to respond to your questions as much as possible during the webinar. Now, let me introduce the first 2 speakers from UNESCO, who will talk about global trends in family literacy and intergenerational learning. Ms. Rokaya Diwara is a program specialist from the section of education policy in the Division for Policies and Lifelong Learning in the UNESCO education sector. She's here as an expert in early childhood care and education. The second speaker is Ms. Rakat Shaliva. She is the leader of the policy support and capacity development team of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. Rakat will provide an overview of family literacy from a perspective of youth and adult literacy. Over the past decades, both subsectors have promoted family literacy, but quite often without much interactions between them. So this presentation brings together the perspectives from ECC and youth and adult literacy. So please be reminded that you have 8 minutes in total. So Rokaya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marie. It is a great honor for me to be with you and to share today with my colleague Rakat the global trends in family literacy and intergenerational learning. As we are making the presentation, I will do my part, the first one in French, and Rakat will continue in English. Thank you so much. To switch maybe for the Anglophone to switch to your interpretation channel by clicking on the globe. Je ne reviendrai pas.
I'm not going to go back over the explanations and the very interesting presentations that have been included in Mr. David Assiona's presentation that set this in context and provided clarification regarding the concepts such as family, education, intergenerational learning, and the way this fits in with the family literacy programs. Rather, I would like to remind everybody that what seems to go without saying for some time now has been highlighted still further with the COVID crisis. We realize that learning cannot be seen solely as taking place in a classroom with a teacher and a standard curriculum, and that we have to look at other opportunities to have a more democratic access to learning and education. Intergenerational learning, family literacy are amongst the options that are available to us in order to move closer to the targets that are not always reached, and also to promote the quality of education offerings. COVID shows us clearly that much learning takes place in the family and in the community and uses various means and resources. It can use various digital media, for instance, or other types of media, and it's the family and the communities that are in the front line. And this is something that we learned very clearly during this crisis, and this highlights still further the importance of focusing on family literacy and learning. And now I would like to come back to the nexus between the various subsectors. Parental education and family literacy often takes place directly with early childhood development. This is an age group where the children are with the parents. This is for the under 3-year-olds. Some children from 3 to 6 are fortunate enough to have access to early childhood learning structures and facilities, but that's not always the case. And parents continue to be the main contacts for learning. There's a lot of interaction. This is also an opportunity to transmit key information about early childhood. Mothers, grandparents, the whole community need to be informed and need to know that what is relevant for this age group, what needs to be done with them, and how they can participate in the full development of the small child. This necessarily involves communication situations, reading, for instance, and the first steps to this are conveyed by parents. In early childhood, there are many opportunities for parents, even if they are illiterate, they can take part in these activities, because at this age, children learn by imitating, by observing their environment. And if they have a parent that is given a book, for instance, and is trying to decipher, to read and to understand the pictures and talk about it with the children, this can structure and lay the basis for their future learning. And there can be a lot of interaction with various structures and other adults. And this can continue in primary education. For 6 to 8-year-olds, there's still early childhood. At this stage, children need support and encouragement, and this emerged also very clearly with the COVID crisis. In the Yaoundé office, we have been working on developing learning aids involving parents a lot, so that parents confronted with a child confronted with difficulty knows they can count on the parents who will help them understand and show them the pictures and help them begin to read. So we have a lot of, if we can move on please, the slides, we have a lot of structures that will help to provide a framework for adults, sessions, for instance, sessions for children, and also joint sessions learning together. Parents who go to literacy classes often appeal to their children who are in primary education or secondary education and ask them to help them in doing the drills, the exercises. But it also works the other way around. Parents will show their children how they can use the various teaching aids that have been made available to them. These joint sessions are extremely important both for the parents and for the children. And children amongst themselves also transmit a lot of knowledge within this framework of intergenerational learning. And I'm going to show you one last slide now about the tools and learning situations. At UNESCO, we have worked with Buba Azaza collection, which has been structured around intergenerational learning. It's a series of books, and we'll see this on the next slides. Here we are, Buba and Zaza, which has been designed with the whole idea of intergenerational learning underpinning it. It's intended for children, but we do realize that this is a reading book for children under the age of 8. But we realized it wasn't easy to read for children in that age group. And so we expect the parents, the grandparents, or older brothers and sisters to read these books to the children. These books cover a lot of themes related to universal values, subjects that are very important for UNESCO and for the countries concerned and the children. And we've had a lot of feedback regarding the huge involvement of parents and the learning environment of the children around this collection of books. When older children read this out to their younger brothers and sisters, and they may only be in primary education themselves, they're also consolidating their own knowledge about the topics they need to understand, and their reading skills also improve. And for the parents, it was an opportunity to communicate on sensitive subjects such as child abuse or AIDS, HIV/AIDS. And it was a way for parents to engage with the children on very sensitive subjects. So this week for early childhood, we've set up a partnership, a global partnership to promote the early childhood learning agenda with member countries. This partnership will lead to a world conference on early childhood in Uzbekistan at the end of 2022. Parents' literacy programs and intergenerational learning should be at the heart of the discussions there and should underpin reflections on how to improve the quality of educational offerings for early childhood. We will have the opportunity to come back to this in more detail because we're going to be working with our colleagues, the UL and Marie and her team, so as to structure that session. And this leads me on to my colleague who's going to continue to talk about the achievements in the terms of literacy and intergenerational learning.
Thank you so much, Rukaya. I think this is a good opportunity for me to pick up where you stopped. I would like to highlight a couple of points which were already shared by the director of the Institute, David Achonera. And UIL's project on family and intergenerational literacy and learning has started since 2008, has been supporting countries developing publications and piloting the models and approaches of family and intergenerational learning in several countries. We do not necessarily focus on at the specific country levels, but we also do regional capacity building, but global as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if I would like to highlight a few of the projects that we have been extensively working on, there's in Ethiopia and the Gambia. One of the members of the project team is today in the session 2, presenting the work in the Gambia. Ethiopia and the Gambia pilot project have focused on piloting the models and designing or developing contextually relevant models of family learning in these two countries, in different communities within these two countries. As Rukaya has already highlighted earlier on, Ethiopia and the Gambia pilots have also identified different types of needs and models, as well as different types of approach to literacy education in these two countries. In the Gambia, you'll hear a little bit more about how the approach such as Reflect and primary-based approach were used in the family literacy pilots in the country, while in Ethiopia, it was based on within the primary education or primary schools, which actually house community learning centers where the adults go to take their literacy and numeracy classes. Next slide, please. We also provided capacity development at the sub-regional levels, which David Agenera has earlier emphasized. In Francophone Africa, we partnered together with PAMUJA West Africa and UNESCO Regional Bureau of Dakar to provide the literacy providers and practitioners an opportunity to develop their understanding of what this approach is, as well as the models of the approach in different countries. In Pakistan, we also supported nationally in the collaboration with Allama Iqbal Open University in understanding the model approach to family and intergenerational learning as well. In Ethiopia and the Gambia, our capacity building also was extended towards supporting family learning program facilitators, developing their capacity and their instructional repertoire in using in the sessions which they were conducting. At the global level, since the pandemic hit, we have started working in collaboration with the Commonwealth of Learning since 2020, and offered two online courses, which were extended for 4 weeks, where a total number of 300 participants, practitioners, providers from around the world have participated in these two offers of the course. We plan to translate these courses into French, Spanish, to offer it and expand the model and approach of family and intergenerational learning to other countries as well. In addition to that, we also realize, as Rukaya has also highlighted, the importance of developing the parents' own understanding and their skills of family learning, and how to also help facilitators in ensuring that the facilitation is of quality and supportive of learning, which actually extends into their homes later on. With that in mind, we are developing at the moment 3 new self-paced, self-directed open access courses for facilitators as well as for parents. The courses will be available starting 2022. In addition to that, we also partner with universities such as UNESCO Chair at the University of East Anglia, but other universities also, in understanding further the approach as applied in different countries and cultures and communities. We are in 2022-2023, we'll be working on the development of handbook on family and intergenerational literacy and learning, with particular focus on emerging research and practice from the Global South. Next slide, please. Thank you. In addition to that, I would like to end my presentation, very brief presentation, with the publications that the UIL has been producing since 2008. These are the publications. You can go into our website and download them freely, all of them in multiple languages. A few of them I would like to highlight is that in 2017, UIL has produced a guideline, a set of guidelines, how to plan, implement, and evaluate family and intergenerational learning approach in different contexts. And in addition to that, policy brief was produced for policymakers to understand about this approach, the benefits of this approach, and the inclusion, how to include this into the policy of the countries. In addition to that, Roka and myself and the teams here, we have worked also on issue note last year in highlighting the importance and potential of family and intergenerational learning in the context of COVID-19 and beyond. I'd like to end my presentation with that. Thank you so much for your attention. Please feel free and contact us with all the questions you have about this work which we do at UNESCO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rukaya and Rakat. Yeah, we have a bit pressed by time, but now I have a pleasure of introducing the next speakers from the University of East Anglia, UK. Ms. Anna Rebington-Pant is a professor of education and the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Adult Literacy and Learning for Social Transformation. Ms. Sira Aikman is a visiting academic at the School of International Development. As previously mentioned, there are multiple approaches to family literacy, but they will provide a global research perspectives on family literacy with a particular focus on the role of Indigenous learning. In our today's society, a globalized and digitalized world, there are increased tensions, including tension between a move towards conversion and standardization and the diversification and pluralism. But there are also increased concerns about the values of different knowledge systems and ways of knowing, as well as epistemic, cognitive, and reparative justice. The SDG, for instance, shed light on the values of Indigenous knowledge, culture, and worldviews. In this context, I had the pleasure to invite Professor Anna Robinson-Pant to take the floor. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mari, and we're delighted to be able to co-host this seminar with UNESCO and UIL and take forward this important area. I'm going to co-present with Sheila Aikman, who I hope is on screen, and we're going to take you now to the research domain and really to remind you of Rachel Hinton's comment at the beginning that research is about changing ways of looking at family literacy in this case. And what we're going to do is to introduce you to the ways in which family literacy and Indigenous learning have been conceptualized within the research literature. So to start at the beginning, Denny Taylor is generally acknowledged to be the first person to use the term family literacy in her seminal work in the 1970s and 80s with families in the US. And she provides a nice rationale here for why families as a site for research. And the bullet points here, you can see she's arguing that they're everyday sites for literacy practices, but they're also very different institutions and sites from schools. And her research looked at children's and parents' personal experiences of everyday life, their reading histories and their everyday emotions and how this influenced literacy. So from this early work, 3 research themes emerged in latter years around parent-child literacy, particularly looking at interactions and implications for school achievement, home literacy practices, looking somewhat at the discontinuity between school literacy practices and home literacy practices like bedtime stories, and intergenerational literacy, which is patterns of learning literacy in families. And that's 2-way learning, not just one way. And just to pause for a moment with the photo here, which I think sums up for me some of the assumptions around family literacy in the mainstream. This is really a typical picture of a family literacy intervention in the US, UK, where children, parents, and teachers are interacting around written text in a very formal institution, usually a school or a classroom or a library. And you'll see some of the assumptions that we have, which underpin the research and the programs, have come out in our earlier discussions today already. So this might characterize, sorry, could I go back? Yeah. Family literacy in the global north, but a lot of these programs have actually been exported to contexts in the global south, and along with it some of the assumptions around parents as the main caregivers rather than perhaps extended family or even the whole community, gendered assumptions around the role of women, and most importantly the focus on schools and formal educational institutions as being the most important sites for children's learning and family literacy. Next slide, please. So there have been a number of challenges that have arisen within the research field, and family literacy has been referred to as a contested area of study. And I've summarized them here with 3 questions, which I think summarize the sort of challenges that we have with the early literature and programs in family literacy. The first one is around which families and why. This is really what has been described as a deficit model of family literacy, the assumption, because a lot of family literacy interventions have focused on poorer, disadvantaged families, in the assumption that children and their families have deficits in their cognitive and social experiences, which then meant that they underperformed at school. By contrast, there is a starting point that the family is rich in linguistic resources, indigenous knowledges, learning that's going on in these environments. And this has informed a lot of more recent work, research on family literacy. The second point I've brought up is why literacy as the starting point. I've deliberately put literacy in the singular and with a capital L, because there has been a lot of discussion about what literacy we're talking about in family literacy. Is it the kind of reading and writing that goes on in schools? And usually it is, but there are many other different literacies, and the new literacy studies, literacy as a social practice, has brought in the idea of everyday literacies, which is what you see in this photo with, this is a father teaching his son in his tailoring shop how to take notes and measurements of customers in southern Nepal. So this is an important direction which family literacy research is going in now, looking at everyday literacies, reading and writing in everyday life, and multimodal literacies, particularly digital literacies, how children and adults engage with social media, for instance, in the home. And finally, there are the big questions about literacy, knowledge, and power, that we're not only talking about different literacies, languages, and knowledges, but unequal literacies. And research has begun to look at these hierarchies really of literacy, possibly the work that's going on with gendered family literacy practices, but particularly, as you'll hear today, indigenous and intergenerational literacy practices in the global south. And this has begun to challenge whether literacy is in fact the most valued communicative practice within all families and communities, and looking much more broadly, as Rakat was saying, at family learning as opposed to more focus on family literacy. Now, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Sheila, who's going to talk a bit more about how Indigenous learning has been conceptualized.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, I want to look at some perspectives on Indigenous learning from an ethnographic approach. But first, perhaps a few words about the terms Indigenous and local. By local, we're referring to people and their learning, which is place-based. And not all local people are Indigenous. Not all research with or by Indigenous peoples is local. But thinking about the concept of Indigenous, I think an important dimension of that is the idea of self-identification, how people describe themselves and why. Because Indigenous, the term is used in very many different ways and has been over time in different parts of the world, with different associations, often quite pejorative and very top-down. As Indigenous peoples, it's important to know about, to be aware of the rights enshrined in international and national laws, including those set out here on this slide, which are very pertinent to today's discussion. An ethnographic approach to Indigenous learning, and should be said to learning more generally, draws on interrelated concepts of language repertoires, plurilingualism, and translanguaging. So to talk a little bit about those, and the focus that they bring on communication and the diversity of and the interconnectedness of different forms of speaking, writing, and non-verbal communication. So asking questions like, how do users of language select and use particular features from their linguistic repertoires in order to negotiate different kind of communication in particular contexts? And to recognize that most peoples and groups' repertoires are plurilingual. They're also dynamic, changing over time, depending on the individual and collective biographies, different social trajectories, paths, life paths, and of course agency. Translanguaging is this dynamic process in which speakers draw from different linguistic features or modes of language from their repertoires, including collective repertoires, to maximize their communicative potential. Next slide, please. So it's the meaningfulness of knowledges and skills for Indigenous peoples that is central to understanding why and how learning takes place. And Indigenous learning, Indigenous intergenerational learning, flourishes in places and spaces that have meaning for people. Okay, places themselves are not neutral. The meaning and value of the learning relates to expectations, memories, and desires associated with specific places and the kinds of social interaction and engagement that are fostered in these places. For example, certain knowledges and skills are valued because they're integral to sustaining livelihoods, which themselves are embedded in particular spiritual, religious worldviews and ways of life. So knowledges and learning practices are not static, but continually being transformed. And there's exciting contemporary research documenting the ways in which young people are active agents of change and transformation, but also of continuity and struggle through their diverse interactions in new and dynamic spaces. For example, research looking into Indigenous peoples and peoples in local contexts, urban, peri-urban context, through experiences of migration and not least through experiences of formal education. So Indigenous peoples of all ages are actively seeking ways to ensure their knowledges, skills and learning support them in their lives, which are severely affected by change, by environmental destruction, and as we clearly heard at COP26, through climate change. I'll hand back to Anna at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. And just to conclude with Denny Taylor again, and this quotation actually from her work in the 1980s about adult literacy and parenting programs then. We thought it was an interesting point to reflect on in this webinar. How can we build on the diversity of learning and literacies in families and communities without resorting to what she described as formalized didactic encounters? So thank you very much, and I hope that's given you some introduction to the research on family literacy and Indigenous learning and how it's changed.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and all the presenters for your informative and insightful interventions. Now we plan to do a Q&A session, but because of the time, we're a bit behind the schedule, so that we would like to keep the poll to provide you the opportunity to share your views. So let us move to the poll session. Okay, do you see the poll on the screen? Yes. So you can see the questions and then also the answers. So unfortunately, this is not available in French and Spanish. So let me read the question so that you can hear in Spanish and French. So firstly, the question. So based on your own context, what can young people and adults gain from family literacy and intergenerational learning? And then there are 7 responses, or 8, there's others. So the first one is the more confidence with helping their children with homework. The second one, more awareness of children's abilities, emotions and aspirations. Third one, more awareness of their own abilities and emotions and aspirations. Fourth one, keeping alive and passing on traditional knowledge and skills. Fifth one, value and joy of learning together as a family. The sixth one, their improved literacy, numeracy, and language skills. And the 7th one, new knowledge and skills obtained from their children, so such as the digital skills. And the last one, others. So if you could click on, choose all that apply and submit, that'd be great. And then I would like to invite 2 speakers, Rakat and Anna, then to analyze and interpret the results of this poll. So please tick the one that you think could be the answer. now we have the responses from 60% of participants. I will wait 30 more seconds and then we close the poll. All right, I think we could close the poll. Could we have the result? Oh, okay, so quite a rounded result. So may I invite the two speakers, Rakat and Anna, maybe to provide your interpretation of this.
Great. No, well, as we were not allowed to vote, it's quite interesting to see what everybody else came up with. And I think it's exciting actually for me to see that the top results are value and joy of learning together as a family and keeping alive and passing on traditional knowledge and skills. And I think possibly I would have voted for that too. So yeah, in fact, most of the results are pretty similar, aren't they, Rakat? In the 60s and 70%.
Yeah, very interesting actually, except I guess with others, I expected more because we couldn't really list down all kinds of benefits that can accrue to all the participants of such learning approaches, I guess. I think I agree with you.
Interesting that literacy, numeracy and language has come the least, isn't it? I mean, it's only between 60 and 75 anyway, but that seemed to be the least kind of popular response.
But I do like actually 75% was given to value and joy of learning together as a family. I guess that's the main purpose of the approach, actually making all the family members learn together from one another.
Absolutely. Yeah. And probably the digital skills is one that might have changed over the last year, as many of us are learning with our children how to use new apps and digital skills in the home.
Maybe Rokaya has another take on this results as an ECD specialist in particular.
No, I think you get it right. I really appreciate also the one on values and learning together as a family, which is really, I think, what is coming up on the mind of most of the participants, and which we can also confirm. This is really a great moment for the family to be together, to sit, to exchange, and also to strengthen each other.
Yeah, thank you. And Ms. Aikman, would you like to also share your view, or is there anything that final word from you?
Yes, thank you. I was thinking about the 70% on keeping alive and passing on traditional knowledge and skills. I think it's really important to think about the notion of traditional knowledge and skills being contemporary knowledge and skills too, that people that's extremely important for people's everyday lives to be, continuing to pass them on and keep them alive and using them as and not just as something from the past, but something that's absolutely vital for the present.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And I think it's indeed interesting to have the others, 12% for others. So if you would like to share what are these others, please feel free to post your ideas, in the chat box, or pose questions, also Q&A section. So now this session is ended. So let me call my colleague, Ms. Rakat. Please remain to chair the next session, which is the session 2 on family and intergenerational learning programs across the world. So thank you very much once again to all the speakers, and then also for your engagement, all the participants. Thank you. Rakat, over to you.
Thank you so much, all the presenters, co-presenters of session 1, and thank you so much, Mari, for moderation of that session. Now I am moderator of the session 2. I have a pleasure to invite 3 speakers on the floor. Mr. Godfrey Sentumbwe, Head of Programs Literacy and Adult Education, Labe in Uganda. Ms. Rana Dajani, Founder and Director of Tagir from Jordan, and Mr. Sekou Diba, a Head of Adult and Non-Formal Education Unit, Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education in the Gambia. May I request all these 3 speakers, please turn on your video, not on your audio until I invite you to the floor. The session on family and intergenerational learning programs across the world will unpack some of the models and challenges, as well as opportunities, benefits that accrue to participants of such programs in the 3 country contexts, Uganda, Jordan, and the Gambia. The questions to the speakers were posed as following. What were the objectives and the key features of your program? What were the main achievements of the program? What benefits accrued to facilitators, learners, and the community at large? What are the main challenges when implementing your programs in different contexts, and how did you address them? And the last question is to reflect on the title of today's webinar. Has the program included any references or integrated indigenous and local knowledges? If yes, how they were done, and what kind of challenges and opportunities and benefits that have accrued? I would like to invite the first speaker of this session, Mr. Godfrey Sentumbwe, to take floor. I would like to remind all the speakers, 3 speakers, that you have maximum 8 minutes. We'll appreciate it if you can follow the time. Thank you so much. Godfrey, over to you.
Thank you, Rakat. First, I would like to start by expressing my webinar organizers for having me today as part of this panel. Next, I would like to describe Labe's work in family literacy and learning since the year 2000. And I can conveniently divide this into 3 distinct phases. The first phase is what we call our initial adventures from the year 2000 to the year 2005. Phase whereby the objectives in general were mainly to strengthen post-conflict provision of education through stronger home and by that time, in much of northern Uganda, where we were operating, communities had just been devastated by civil war. So we wanted to use family literacy and intergenerational learning as the quickest way of restoring normalcy, going back to resume normal life. But equally, we were also recognizing the social capital within the extended family system in the region where we're operating. So it was imperative to improve literacy and numeracy skills among rural children and their parents using the existing social capital which hadn't completely broken down. Our target groups were mostly the rural families who are speakers of largely less written and hence low status languages. We also had out of school children and youth who had missed out on normal formal education. We also wanted to reach primary school children, especially in the lower primary grades 1 to 3, and their teachers. And equally bring on board the adult literacy facilitators if we are to really bridge, or if we are really to strengthen the home-school links. The teaching content which we are basing on was the school-based literacy. Why? Again, because we wanted to respond to the practical literacy needs of the adult learners, mostly the women, who are asking us in adult literacy classes to provide them with the literacy skills that would enable them to support their children's learning in the homes. So we ensured that the sort of content that they were acquiring in adult literacy classes would enable them to improve the educational performance of their children through effective literacy support, through effective family literacy support. Unfortunately, this is where the major challenges emerged during that phase. Sorry, don't go to that slide yet. In that phase, the biggest challenge that we faced were the divergent aims of the national functional adult literacy providers versus the specific practical learning needs of the adult learners. Literacy skills, which are school-based, to help them support children educational at home. But the National Functional Adult Literacy Program of the government was interested in providing adult literacy, which is more inclined towards livelihoods of the adults, income generation, disease prevention. So this was already a challenge. What happens if you just ignore the national aims of the national providers' aims and go in for the practical literacy needs of the adults, which are school-based? No wonder during this period, this pilot program in family learning was being labeled as schooling for adults that were not responding to the general aim of the National Functional Adult Literacy Program. But again, if we went in for if we responded to the national file provider's aim, there was a real risk of adult learners not attending or participating in these classes, which is usually the case in most adult literacy programs across the world, where you don't respond to their practical learning needs. The next big challenge again we had was the English medium instruction in schools versus the local language instruction which we're using in the adult literacy groups. The curriculum in the school was being provided in English, right from primary 1 at that time. So if you were a provider of adult literacy, which is supporting parents to provide meaningful educational support to children, how will English be of any use to them when they are not themselves proficient in this language? However, by the end of this phase, we had managed to expand and cover 600 villages and 18 schools in 8 war-affected districts of northern Uganda.
Godfrey, you have 2 minutes.
So fortunately, you can continue. Next slide. Fortunately, we had two landmark education policies that greatly solved these challenges. And these were the language in education policy, local language in education policy of and the 2007 ECD policies. These policies enabled us to undertake micro-level activities that are needed to implement the national level policies. One, government had launched these policies, but at local level, they had not been adequately implemented. Local materials were not in existence. So there was no way teachers would teach in a local language without materials. And in ECD, much as the 2000 policy ECD policy recognized the home-based ECD as one of the ECD provisions, there was no structure in place which they had put up to show how this can be done. Instead, what was mostly available was the formal ECD provision by private providers. And this was out of reach for marginalized families living in a post-conflict communities. However, through these two projects which were developed, the Mother Tongue Education Project and the Children's School Readiness and Retention Project, to respond to the new policies which were in place, we were able to come up with some achievements like the Pedagogy Handbook for teaching in the local language. This is a national resource now used by teachers across Uganda, provide teaching in their local languages. So this was an opportunity for our family learning program, because what we are teaching in adult literacy in families, again, could be transmitted or could be carried over into formal school, especially in the early grades where mother tongue was the medium of instruction. We were also able to have local language orthographies developed in less written languages where we are operating, meaning that it was now possible for parents, teachers, and children to have access to some locally written materials in their languages. However, again, we still had the problem of getting all of this work located in communities away from the schools. And that's why we came up with, next slide, please.
Unfortunately, Godfrey, we have to really go to your last slide, if it's okay. I'm really sorry, yeah?
Oh, okay, please, let's go to the last slide.
Yeah.
The last one, sorry. The conclusion is and lesson is we have learned that family literacy and learning initiatives can offer opportunity for community participation and agency in education, particularly where government authorities are unable to implement their own policies. And the second lesson we are also learning from this work is that the foundation for sustainable integration of indigenous local knowledge is premised in having strong bilingual, multilingual family literacy learning programs.
I'm really sorry. Thank you so much, Godfrey, for your wonderful presentation about the work that your organization is doing in Northern Uganda. And I'm sure that participants have a lot of questions to your program. I would like to invite Godfrey and all the participants who have questions to Godfrey, please use Q&A And then Godfrey, I'm sure you will be able to respond to many of the questions. I see both on the chat as well, but please take your questions to the Q&A so that Godfrey can read and respond directly there. I would like to invite the next speaker, Ms. Rana Dajani, from the organization We Love Reading, to present the case, what is happening in Jordan about family reading program. Ms. Rajani, you have also 8 minutes. Please, I will really appreciate if you could speak within the time. Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Over to you. Of course. Thank you very much for inviting me to share our experience from We Love Reading to this community and beyond. Next slide, please. Next. So what we realized that reading for fun is very important. Yet most children do not read for fun. They read for education, but not for fun. Although reading for fun is what unleashes the imagination, enriches the vocabulary, unleashes emotions, but most importantly, teaches empathy and allows the child to think beyond his immediate or her immediate position, to dream and to become the hero he or she reads about. Next, please. And so in order to foster the reading for pleasure, a child has to fall in love with reading. So the question that I wanted to tackle was, how do I help a child fall in love with reading? Next slide. And what we realized through research, that the way to do that is by having parents or caregivers read aloud to their children in the family, because especially when the child is young, even as young as when the mother is pregnant. Next, please. Because when the child's brain is developing, the neurons are creating associations, and that results in the child's mind of the development of associations between reading and feeling secure and happy and taken care of, that stays with them when they're adults. Next, please. So when they're adults, when they're happy, they want to read. When they're sad, they want to read, because it gives them that very nice, fuzzy kind of feeling. Next slide. And so in order to foster that love of reading, we can't train every parent to read aloud. That's impossible. So what We Love Reading does is that we train one person in the neighborhood, a volunteer, who we call the We Love Reading ambassador, on how to read aloud to the children in a fun way, in their native language, from local books, from the local culture and context, to boost the identity and to make that connection with the brain, because it's in the native tongue. And so this training later became called We Love Reading, and our mantra is changing mindsets through reading to create change makers. Next slide, please. And so this training can train anybody, any age group, any sector from the community, from age 16 to 100. They don't even have to be highly educated, because in the end, all they're doing is reading a picture book with a few lines of text, and they can even make up the story, and it will add to the fun and the magic of the reading for the child. So the training takes the ambassador, the adult, on a journey from raising awareness to the importance of reading for fun, to learning how to actually read in a fun way to attract the children. And we insist on using real books, not technology, because not everybody has technology, not everybody has internet. But more importantly, we evolved as a species to communicate human to human. And that is why that's important for fostering that love of reading, to reap the benefits of reading. Then they learn in the training how to start their own reading aloud session. This can be anywhere. It could be their home, under a tree, a community center, a church, a mosque. They know better. And so they become masters at running this reading aloud session. So it's more about the experience than the actual physical location, to create an enabling environment for the child to fall in love with reading. And then next, because of COVID, we have moved the training online, and now it's in 10 languages, so that anybody can access it wherever they are in the world in a very low-tech way. So we use technology only for the adults, not for the children. Next slide, please. And so the most important thing about this, as UNESCO has identified with us, is that this is not just a program for children. This is about building agency and ownership and a feeling of responsibility in the youth and adults that are reading aloud to the children. So they discover their voices, not just literally by reading aloud, but figuratively, becoming leaders. Next slide. Because suddenly, they, rather than walking aimlessly, especially in refugee contexts or vulnerable communities, not knowing what's going to happen, having stress and anxiety and lack of hope, now through reading aloud, they have some control over their lives, they have some agency, which is so important to reduce stress and build up resilience. And we call that our secret sauce. So our programming, although we don't pay them, these are volunteers, yet even after 7 years from the initial training, these people are still reading aloud to the children in refugee camps, because even when multiply displaced, because they take the program with them wherever they are. They don't require a place, they don't require a salary, and they do it for themselves. And that is very, very important, and something we tend to forget. Next slide, please. And so the impact goes not just the ambassador who's reading aloud and the children, but to the wider community. And this program started out as an early childhood reading and learning program, and then realized it's about reducing mental health and boosting resilience, and especially during COVID next, because in COVID, the children are out of school. This becomes a placeholder. There's a lot of stress. This becomes a safe haven for a parent and a child to engage in a fun way. To help heal. And it's also a program for social entrepreneurship, because now all the We Love Reading ambassadors have changed their mindset to a mindset of I can. So going, not just reading aloud to the children, but realizing that if I can do that, what else can I do to help my community? And therefore addressing many of the SDGs. And now, because of that, we have a global network of people on the street level, from the grassroots, who can push out any program or any advice, and also a way to gather information to know what's happening. Next slide, please. And where the program now has spread to 63 countries, actually around the world, and reaching more than 500,000 children, because it's become a social movement. Next slide, please. And the other important thing about our program is, because I'm a scientist, I'm a biologist, I invite scientists to come and study the impact of the program so that we can develop it better and to learn how it's working. Next slide. So we partnered with Brown University to study the behavior of children. Next slide. And we found out that all their executive functions improved as a result of being part of the We Love Reading program, which has an impact on their schooling and later life. Next slide. We also worked with local universities, and we found that this improvement in executive function was profound for everybody, but even more so for those coming from lower socioeconomic status. So this is a way to jump the poverty gap in a very low-cost program that is run by the community for the community. Next slide, please. And we've also shown that if we read particular books with particular themes, like about the environment or gender or disabilities or refugees, we can actually change children's behavior in a much more efficient way than TV ads or billboards. Next slide. And finally, we have shown with the University of Chicago, next slide, please. That we have also been able to improve empathy in children. Now we are studying the parent-child interaction with NYU Abu Dhabi, next slide, and Queen Mary University, and also how the youth, next slide, please, how the adult herself, the majority of them are women, next slide, how that improves their feeling of confidence, self-awareness, to become leaders in their own community. Next slide, please. And so the impact of the community in the same thing, that instead of waiting for governments to save them or blaming governments, for each member in the community to see themselves as a change maker and take upon themselves that responsibility to make a difference, all through reading. Next slide.
You have 1 minute.
Next slide. Okay, so over time, we see that We Love Reading as a social movement is moving from our organization to be picked up by other organizations around the world, and then eventually by people and individuals, so that we cease to have a reason to exist, because everybody is actually reading aloud to their children. Next slide. Next. So we are innovative because we have the secret sauce of changing people to have a mindset of I can, which is so important, and having a framework of a program that is a bare skeleton that anybody can pick up, because it's based on universal values, yet flexible enough to be tailored to the specific culture and context, especially of the mother tongue. Next. And we use technology in a way where we harness it rather than it harnessing us. Next slide. Next, please. Next, please. It's stuck. And not with the children, because the children need a real book. Next, please. Next. Yeah, so we have succeeded because we are grassroots. We're not an institution from the West coming in, but very grassroots. It's human-centered, only focused on reading, a unique niche. It's very focused, it's research-based, and we have a business model, and now it's a social movement, winning multiple awards and being recognized. Last slide. Yeah, so our motto is the butterfly effect, which is a theory in physics of chaos. When a butterfly flutters its wings in one part of the world, it moves the air a centimeter. That results in change over time and space to create a hurricane beyond what we can imagine. Next slide. Thank you very much. Next slide.
There's a lag. I think there is a connection. Yeah.
Sorry.
Jamin?
We're done. So thank you very much. You can follow us and ask us any question whenever you want. And by the way, I'm speaking to you from WISE, where we just had the Deputy General from UNESCO giving a panel talk right now in the next room beside me. So it's very nice that the whole world is working on education to make a difference.
Thank you so much for this very interesting and passionate presentation on family reading, and I really liked the emphasis that you made at the start of your presentation on love of reading as an emotionally engaged but also fun activity of family members, and wonderful how you incorporated science knowledge into the project itself. And I would like to request all the participants and also Dr. Rana to remain on the webinar and then respond to the questions on Q&A, which we have already several of these. And there were questions related to how family learning can respond to different bilingual, multilingual contexts, and also the issues related to the disabilities, children with disabilities. Maybe you can take these questions to Mr. Godfrey and Ms. Rana to the Q&A, and they can respond to based on their programmatic experiences in Jordan and Uganda. Thank you so much. May I now request the third speaker of this session, Mr. Sekou Diba. I heard that he's having problem with connection back in Gambia. Can anyone let me know whether Mr. Diba is here? Hello? Hello? Okay, I assume, hello, Mr. Diba, Sekou Diba, you are online. Can you please unmute and can you please maybe try to speak? Maybe. Yes, he's logged in, but we cannot see him and we cannot hear him. Hello? Maybe while we wait to Mr. Diba, I would like to request everybody please use Q&A to respond to the questions, to raise the questions for the speakers. To the speakers, they can directly respond to them on the Q&A chat. Mr. Diba, thank you so much. If you could unmute.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for being able to join us today. I'm inviting you to make your presentation. You have 8 minutes. One of my colleagues here will be projecting your presentation. Please, over to you. Hello? You have to unmute. Yes.
Is it okay?
Yes, it's okay. You have 8 minutes,
okay.
Please. Yeah.
Okay, I am Mr. Sekou Diba from the Gambia, making presentation on the experiences and challenges of implementing family learning program in the Gambia. Yes, let's go. Let me start with the objective. The first objective is to promote literacy and the culture of learning among traditional. The objective is to break down artificial barrier between learning in different settings. Another objective is to combine learning sessions of both adults and children and enhance their literacy, numeracy, and learning skills. Okay, next slide. To promote the literacy, to provide free and avoidable preschool education for communities that are educationally disadvantaged. The last objective is to make parents develop keen interest in the education of their children. So these are some of the objectives of family literacy in the Gambia. Next slide. Yes, let's go. Okay, we come to the target populations. The program particularly targets parents, preschool children, and school-going children. So we come to the teaching methodology or approach adopted during this program. Mainly is reflect and phonic approach. This is what we, this been adopted by 2 organizations that participated in the pilot project. So when it comes to reflect approach, this was used by FIH, that's a feature in our hands. Through this method, the facilitator engages the learners in discussion about issues affecting their lives, and in the process of which learners strengthen their ability to read and write. And one of the reasons why they choose this approach is that they have the conviction that adult learners engage in learning better when teaching content is related to their daily life. And they continue to participate better when the facilitator recognizes learners' knowledge and experience in teaching. Yes, next slide. We come to the phonic approach. That's the primer. Next slide. The primer, that one we use by ABWE, Association of Baptists of World Evangelism. This is a faith-based NGO that use this phonic approach. Basically, this approach focuses on individual sounds made by letters. There's letter identification, letter sound. So the approach is based on that. Next slide. So we come to the achievement of the program in the Gambia. Next slide. Baseline and L-line survey was conducted. The baseline survey was conducted trying to determine the literacy level of the literacy participants prior to intervention. And L-line was carried out, used out to determine the learning outcome. Field project was embraced by all stakeholders, particularly the communities and beneficiaries in the project area. Basic literacy and numeracy skills of the project beneficiaries have greatly improved as compared to the results during the baseline. And another achievement is learners were able to demonstrate their skill in reading and writing and in their local languages, and recognize numbers and calculate 1- and 2-digit numbers. Another achievement is the development and production of literacy material, which are later distributed to all learning centers. And program participants were more enlightened due to the increased awareness about happening in their surroundings. Parents and children adopting the culture of sitting together and learn in the same environment, and this was not only practiced during class, but continue at home. Another major achievement is successful completion or implementation of 2 pilot phases within agreed time frame. So we come to the other aspect, that is the beneficiaries. Let's go on another slide. Another slide. Okay, benefit to the literacy participant. We start with school-going children who attended the field classes and reported that their participation helped them improve their reading abilities and understanding of some of the topics, especially in the case of learning numbers and arithmetical operation at school. Adult learners appreciated the field program since their basic literacy and numeracy skill helped them not to be deceived by others in their daily operation. Parents reported that field classes enabled them to assess, to some extent, the performance of their children in school by identifying and counting numbers of correct and wrong marks in the workbooks. Many adult learners attest that they can now tell time and use mobile and receive call. They can use mobile and make call. Yes, let's go to another slide. Another slide. Yes, another slide. Okay, the benefit of the facilitators. Facilitators express confidence to be able to the benefit to the community, join literacy classes, also foster cooperation and social cohesion among the adult and their children. Parents also stated with the joy that spending time in learning with their children together also made them witness children's gradual development of their critical thinking skills, which contributed to a closer bond between children and themselves. Study program initiative at household level was applauded by community leaders for the fact that it will make their children focus on learning and thereby develop a good reading culture among children instead of loitering about. Next slide. Next slide.
Seiko, you have 1 minute. If you could go to the last slide and conclude, it will be very good. Thank you.
Okay. Now let's move to the other slide. That is let me go to the challenges. One of the challenges is duration of the program was too short to complete the course outline, and field was piloted at the time when the farmers are busy on the farm, because most of the study participants are farmers. Domestic chores take much of the time of the learners, especially during farming season. And the timetable of children attending lower basic school classes with the field, because we have children attending both field classes and the lower basic class. But strategies we are deploy is provision of milling machines. You have to reduce the burden of domestic chores so that they could have focus on their learning activities. That is for the adult. And provision of blackboard and the furniture. And we also suggest that a flexible timetable could be introduced so that a class or conflict between farming activities or domestic works could be minimized. And rescheduling and also rescheduling of the program out of the harvest season. A more flexible timetable was introduced so that a class or conflict between school, lower basic, and community learning center timetable could be avoided. And some of the challenges again, yes.
Thank you. The last sentence, please. Sorry.
The last sentence is we still with the inadequate infrastructure, that's such a shortage of venues for literacy classes or lack of blackboard. Some centers conducted their learning centers in open spaces. These are challenges. And some venues are not protected, leave it open for anyone to pass by and interrupt lesson. But one of the solutions we have recommended, affected learners were asked to use their nearby conventional school, which are furnished with furniture. And learners were asked to bring along their benches and stool to the classes where there is no furniture. And we have another challenge. There's many people with good qualification were not hired because they demand high remuneration, they asked for the big salaries. There was no adequate pre-service training provided for them to build their capacities. So the solution here, we suggest that we want to use the polyvalent teachers from nearby basic secondary school into literacy centers and to improve.
Thank you so much, Seiko. I have
to focus on in-service training and pedagogical. Yes.
I have to stop.
And another challenge is all people. Some people are.
Seiko, hello. Okay, I have to unfortunately to stop here. We are already past the half an hour time of our webinar. Thank you so much for your presentation and highlighting some of the key challenges when piloting such an approach in the context of the Gambia and two communities. I'm sure that participants have more questions to you. I would like to request everyone to use question and answer for that. And the speakers, Mr. Godfrey Setumve, Ms. Rana Dajani, Mr. Sekou Diba, I would like to thank you for sharing very interesting programmatic experiences and challenges and opportunities that you have identified through your programs and provided opportunity for the learners and families in different country contexts. Thank you so much. I would like to summarize the session with one sentence, is that as you have seen from three presenters, we have different models and different purposes and different type of energies and materials and human resources that are required to run such programs in the countries such as Uganda, Jordan, as well as in the Gambia. I would like to thank everybody. Now over to the next session, unfortunately without any break. We can have, actually, I'm a trained teacher by myself, so I would like to request everyone who has been sitting since morning just to get up and stretch like I do. And then I'll invite Anna Robinson-Pan to take over from me to moderate the next session. Quite interesting. We are moving now from practice to research. And maybe Anna, you give us 1 minute to get up and stretch. Yeah. Thank you. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Rakat, and thank you for a second or two to stretch too. I'm really sorry that we missed the break here. So in this session, we're going to move back to research again and look, this is called Researching the Links Between Indigenous Learning and Family Literacy. And we're going to hear some research evidence findings from Ethiopia, Malawi, Nepal, and the Philippines. And I'm delighted to introduce this session on behalf of the UEA UNESCO Chair in Adult Literacy and Learning for Social Transformation, which is a partnership between UEA and university departments specializing in adult literacy in these countries. So this is a session for you to hear about some of the ethnographic research, which Sheila was referring to earlier, on family literacy and Indigenous learning that's been conducted over the past year by our team. And I'm going to hand over at this point to Chris Milora, who is going to chair the session. He is the research associate for this project on family literacy, Indigenous learning, conducted by the UNESCO chair. And he recently completed his PhD at the UEA and has been an important force behind this project. So Chris, can I hand over to you now to introduce our speakers and the project?
Yes, thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction. I'll just give a bit of a brief overview of the project that you're going to hear about today. It's part of this project entitled Family Literacy, Indigenous Learning and Sustainable Development, which is part of a larger project funded by the UK Research and Innovation's Global Research Translation Awards. And the main aim of this research project is to translate research findings into development policy and practice, particularly in the Global South. In fact, the project that you're going to hear about today, the aim is to demonstrate how a community-based and intergenerational approach to family literacy can contribute to the achievement of selected SDGs such as education, gender equality, and health, when it is built on local and or indigenous knowledge and practices. As what Anna said, we are all the team that's conducting this project are part of the UEA UNESCO Chair in Adult Literacy and Learning for Social Transformation. And the idea of this project actually emerged from what Anna said earlier in her introduction about the tensions around transplanting some of the approaches to literacy, to family literacy that are coming from UK and the US to communities in the Global South. So for example, what has been often seen as the gold standard of family literacy or family learning is when parents read storybooks to children, an activity that might not be as common and as familiar in some of the places where we work. So questions like, what about learning within families as part of agricultural work or farming or fishing, Some of them does not involve any texts at all. How about learning religious practices across different generations? Or how about learning beyond the family and within or among communities? A unique aspect of this project is its ethnographic approach to research. And when we speak of ethnographic, it means that the researchers that you're going to hear from today actually visited these research sites, conducted informal chats with the families and the communities, and observed their daily activities and livelihoods. So we get a very detailed understanding of their lives. And this project draws from these research findings to develop a very unique approach to family literacy. And just to say that we are now at the stage of the project, at the third stage of the project development. We've recently published the country reports and the synthesis report, which I think our colleague has posted in the chat box. You can check out the synthesis and the country reports. And the event today and tomorrow will be towards disseminating the ideas from the research and explore with you how they may be applicable to policy and practice in your contexts or at the international level. In fact, the country teams are also in the process of setting up regional and local policy-focused workshops to test these ideas. And a major component of this project is developing literacy and curriculum materials based on the insights arising from the project. So just the format, we're going to hear from 4 country teams. Ethiopia, we'll start with Malawi, then Nepal, then the Philippines and Ethiopia. If you have any questions for the speaker, just like what Rakat said earlier, please write them at the Q&A and we will respond to the questions there. Yes, and then I'm now going to introduce the first presenter, who is Dr. Amadou Mjaya and Dr. Jean Chivula, who are both lecturers at the University of Malawi. Amadou and Jean, can I take the floor, please?
Good afternoon. I will start and then Amadou will take up later. Next slide. Yeah, so Malawi, just like other countries, has low literacy levels. And we also notice a gender gap that exists. The adult literacy rates for men is estimated at 72%, while that for women is at 66%. We are also aware of the government's efforts in introducing adult literacy. Since independence, the Malawi government has been offering adult literacy education to individuals aged 15 and above who are regarded as non-literate. For school-going children, the government, as well as non-governmental organizations, have also been involved in literacy initiatives, which in most cases emphasize the role of parents in adult literacy. The role of parents in their children's education. We see a picture there, a mother helping her children with reading. This is one of the efforts of one of the non-governmental organizations that we came through when we were doing field work. However, there are some local learning practices and approaches which seem to have been ignored. And our study focuses on these local learning practices and approaches. In this presentation, we focus on some of the learning practices we observed during our study. The study was conducted in 2 districts in Malawi, that is Salima and Machinga. In this slide, we see some of the activities that community members were involved in. These are some of the activities that we came across during our ethnographic research. The first picture on top, we see some fisher folks getting ready for fishing. And then the next picture below it, we see a woman with her nieces involved in mat weaving. The third picture on top, we also see some women involved in rice transplanting. We move down to the fourth picture. We see a young boy in Liwonde forest. The young boy with some women are hunting for mushrooms. The last picture, which shows the young boy in the forest, is the focus of this presentation. My colleague, Ahmad, will share with you a story about this young boy, how he learns by observing as adults are collecting mushrooms. Over to you, Ahmad.
Thank you, Jean, and welcome everyone. As Jean has mentioned, our presentation will focus on local learning practices based on this young boy. We met this boy, next please, next slide. We met this boy in Liwonde Forest Reserve, which you see on the left as you face the screen. He had gone there with his mother to hunt for mushrooms. What caught our attention was the fact that apart from helping his mother carry the bucket in which the mushrooms were put, the boy was busy gathering mushrooms. We observed that whenever he found a mushroom, the boy took it over to his mother to confirm whether the mushroom was edible or not. On any occasion, we saw the mother carefully examine the mushroom before telling the boy to put it in the bucket or to throw it away. In so doing, we noted that the boy was learning to differentiate edible and non-edible mushrooms. Apart from learning to differentiate edible and non-edible mushrooms, the boy appeared to be learning some other skills and knowledge. In Liwonde National Park, there were different types of mushrooms, and these mushrooms grew in different locations. So the boy appeared to be learning both. In the picture on the right, you have red mushrooms. These mushrooms had local names. For instance, the red ones were called chipatwe. And below it, you have another set of mushrooms which were called utenga. And on the top, the single mushroom, that one was called mangungunguli. And below it, you have another set of mushrooms, which was called dododido. So the boy was not only learning about where these mushrooms grew, he also learned the names of these mushrooms. In addition, the boy was also learning some other techniques. For instance, to keep the mushrooms clean, he was avoiding uprooting them with the soil. To keep the mushrooms fresh, he covered them with fresh leaves. And to avoid breaking them up, he was using the bucket. All these skills were necessary for the mushroom gatherers. And we were also amazed by the boy's awareness of the dangers of mushroom gathering. I was personally following this boy behind him. And at one point, he cautioned me, saying, "Sir, please be careful. There is a snake." I looked around, I never saw one. But he had seen it. So in all these, we were made to understand that there was a great deal of local learning practices taking place in this particular community. And based on the experience we had with this bomb, we made several conclusions. And these are presented on the next slide, which we invite you all to read and reflect upon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Amadou, for that very rich story of the mushroom farmers. And it's a good case study of local learning within families, as you said. We'll now move on to Nepal, and I'm going to introduce Ms. Sushan Acharya, who's professor at Tribhuvan University in Kathmandu, and Mr. Kamalraj Devkota, who's a lecturer at the same university. Sushan?
Yeah, namaste, everyone. And Kamal?
Yes, namaste, everyone. In this presentation, we will be talking on translanguaging and literacy in sustaining cultural heritages, especially with reference to religious and cultural practices of indigenous communities in Nepal. It is a part of our broader research we conducted on family literacy and intergenerational learning. Next slide, please. In this presentation, we will first highlight on research context, and then we will make some of the findings here, especially different communities from 4 different areas. One among the caste cultural group, our research on family literacy. Especially in this presentation, we are not going to cover all the context, all the community context yet. We will focus more on Gurung community and their family literacy. We will highlight how Gurungs simultaneously used 2 languages, their own mother tongue, Gurung language, and Nepali language, the second language, in their literacy practices. As you know, Gurung is one among the ethnic groups. 2011 population census of the country has identified it as one among the 50 hill ethnic groups. And it is the group with Tibeto-Burman origin. It has a rich linguistic, cultural, and religious traditions. Mostly, Gurungs live in the mid-hill districts of Nepal, and it shares 2% of the total population of the country. Gurung, as we conducted our fieldwork in a big village in Nepal, it is located in western part of Nepal. And based on our, let's say, fieldwork, here the background image you can see a ritual activity, ritual practice that you can see taken place in community context. And here you can see the people of older generation and at the same time younger generation are learning. Now over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Kamal, and namaste, everybody. Now I'm going to present some examples from the Gurung community where 2 languages were simultaneously used. The first picture is, it's a Gurung astrologer's handwritten book with his mantras and rituals that he collected from his gurus and also from ancient books. And here he has both Nepali and Gurung language written, but Gurung is also written in Devanagari script. Devanagari script is a standard script written used in Sanskrit and Nepali and Hindi and many other languages spoken in India and Nepal. And in the second picture, it's a printed, what they called Gurung Veda. It's a collection of oral stories, mantras, and myths, and it's about Gurung philosophy of life and living. And younger generations who volunteered to digitalize this Gurung Veda, which was only orally transmitted, and then computerized and printed. And then the older generation, the gurus and the astrologers were happy. Doing this, their younger generation can now follow their rituals, values, knowledge, and practices. Next slide, Chris, please. And here is another examples how two languages are simultaneously used. It's a gate of a Gurung temple, and they have written in both languages. The written text emphasizes how learning is needed. I mean, how important it is to learn the philosophy of life and living. And if we don't do that, the history will disappear, and then the humankind will disappear. So this all emphasis on learning is written on the gate of the temple. Next slide, please. And with this, we conclude that literacy in the form of reading, writing, and even oral communicative practices are rooted in this Gurung community tradition and rituals. But these literacy practices are not visible. It's hidden from the mainstream policy and programs. And they are aloof of this kind of community practices. And Gurungs are using two languages, mother tongue and second language, to enable their younger ones to give continuity to their philosophy, their tradition. But yet there's a question whether second language can fully sustain the indigenous values and cultures. And our third conclusion is that digitalization of Gurung Veda is an excellent example of intergenerational learning, and as well as this suggests that indigenous practices are not fixed, they are changing. Thank you, Chris. We are done.
Thank you very much, Sushan. And I think that's a great example of the role of literacy in continuing traditions and culture in this context. Now let's move on to the Philippines, where we are joined by Ms. Gina Lontoc, who's faculty member of the College of Education at the University of Santo Tomas, and Ms. Camila de Jesus Vizconde, who's the Assistant Dean at the Graduate School of the University of Santo Tomas, Philippines. Gina and Dr. Camila.
Thank you so much, Chris. Good day, everyone. The Philippine team's focus for this study is on promoting intergenerational learning and lifelong learning through local and indigenous knowledge production within the context of a smallholder farming community in Nueva Ecija and in an indigenous community of Aitas in Pampanga. In this study, we use the term local knowledge for the knowledge produced, developed, and sustained in the mainstream community in Nueva Ecija, and indigenous knowledge for the system of beliefs, practices, skills, cultures, heritage, and tradition possessed and cultivated by the Aitas in Pampanga. Next slide, please. On this slide, the photo on top shows the farmers working the field in Nueva Ecija, and the one below is one of the houses of the Aitas that we visited in the lowland. And let me just explain to you the notion of family in our context. We are known for having close family ties, which means that this often includes extended family members living in our household. Thus, in this study, the notion of what constitutes a family is not limited to parent-child interactions, but includes siblings, grandparents, guardians, and relatives within the same household. The farmers who are involved in this study were recipients of cash grants from the government, and most of them are landless and are employed as farm workers. They were selected because of the richness of their practices in promoting literacies in the context of sustainable livelihoods, in particular in the context of organic agriculture. Interestingly, our participants had formed an organization which involved livelihood-related activities such as family and community gardening, organizing small enterprise, and forming self-help groups on farming and parenting. As for the Aitas, they used to live on slopes of Mount Pinatubo until it violently erupted in 1991, forcing them to relocate to the lowlands. Most of them have maintained their hunter-gatherer mode of living, but due to the contact with lowlanders, they now engage in farming, trading, and other alternative forms of livelihood. At this point, I pass the virtual floor to Dr. Visconde to share with us some of the findings of our research. Dr. Visconde?
Thank you, Gina. Next slide, please. As viewed in this slide, these are the women from Nueva Ecija. Many are involved in agriculture as their main livelihood. They integrate their local knowledge into their everyday activities, including their livelihood. For instance, in their planting of vegetables like string beans, the one that you see in the slide, they usually use seeds for the vegetables. And it's interesting to learn how they dry and preserve the seeds for planting. Preservation of seeds here will start with harvesting the seeds from the excesses or from those which were not sold. Then they pick out the good ones. They dry the seeds in the heat of the sun before storing them in wine or alcohol bottles. Aling Juana, who is one of the women, advised that wine bottles are best for preserving the seeds, as the alcohol content prevents the molds from forming. So Aling Juana, as you see them there on the picture with the husband, Mang Merting, and their children, are involved in the preservation of seeds as they use them during the planting season. So next slide, please. So you will see here in the slide, the focal point now is the indigenous group, the Aitas. As stated by the indigenous chieftain, Marcela, the ancestral domain remains the best school for teaching the younger generation their culture. So food, behavior, and other economic activities, which they hope would be appreciated and maintained by the younger generation. As you can see from this slide, there is that tool for catching the fish. It's like a bow and arrow, and it's used for gathering food. They used it in targeting the fish and catching them in this way in rivers. As seen in the slide, the elder and the young men were able to have a good catch of tilapia. That's the fish, that's how we call it here, from the river, which they ride their motorcycle now to bring home the catch. Their expertise in catching the fish through this tool is passed on to the younger Aitas, who seem to do well, as you can see here in their day's catch. It is this hope of this indigenous group that this type of practice will be passed on from one generation to the other. Gina?
Thank you, Dr. Visconde. We also observed shift in the teaching role within families, and this is due to the integration of technology. For instance, Eduardo, who uses his mobile phone to communicate with his wife, who works in the Middle East, observed that his children are better at working out how to use the internet and have more access to mobile technology. In the community, as you can see in the picture, women farmers support each other in learning about mobile technology. Normally, it is the younger members of their local farming association who teach the older ones how to navigate a device. Among the Aitas, the cyberspace is also used to communicate with their family members, particularly families with children who are studying in another town. We observe that younger Aitas are more active on social media. They have Facebook accounts, which they use to connect with their peers and even host Facebook Live events. However, among older ITAs, mobile phones have a distinct purpose, and this is to document their indigenous practices. Chief Marcela, in particular, narrated that she takes photos and videos of their daily activities, which she showed to her children so that they will not forget the indigenous ways of the natives. So in conclusion, we can say that in the Philippines, family literacy and intergenerational learning often occur in everyday activities within the household and connected to livelihoods. This supports the SDGs as the project hopes that adults and children alike become lifelong and life-wide learners who are aware of their own existing literacies and continue to develop them. Many of these literacies are seen as family practices and behaviors, and this define how each member of the family relate to each other in terms of learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gina. And I think that's a very good example of the use of digital tools as well in digital spaces within families. Now we'll move on to Ethiopia, and I'd like to call on the floor Mr. Abi Menkir Gizao, who's assistant professor at Bahir Dar University in Ethiopia, and Ms. Turuwark Zalala Morkine, who's the UNESCO Chair Coordinator at Bahir Dar University, Ethiopia. Abi and Turuwark.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Chris has mentioned earlier, this study is part of a UCRI-funded project on family literacy, indigenous learning, and sustainable development. The study is conducted in Ahmara region. As can be seen on this picture, it's a cover page of a country report. The three photos represent the three research sites. One of the research sites is Awi Zone, where agriculture is a dominant means of living. It's a semi-urban area and it's where several kinds of crafts are practiced and learned informally across generations. The second site is Bahir Dar city, which is a regional capital and chosen to represent the urban context. The third site is Auramba. It's a self-made and unique community that is established with the vision of building Ethiopian society by challenging gender inequality and by nurturing culture of cooperation. Ethnographic research approach was used. The study focused on different domains like health, religion, craft, ICT, varieties of learning spaces such as marketplaces, coffee ceremony, and etc. Although we have found several instances where the two seem rivals, as well as where they exist in partnership, today's presentation will focus only on the findings related to traditional church education. Next slide, please. We want to give a brief background on traditional church education. Ethiopia accepted Christianity in the 4th century AD, and traditional church education is as old as Christianity itself. This kind of education was the dominant center for literacy and learning until the introduction of Western-style formal education in 1908. Even after the introduction of formal education, parents continued sending their children to church education so that they learn literacy before they entered formal schooling. Church education has different contents organized into different schools. These are reading, church music, church dance, poetry, and literature. The students are not supposed to learn all the contents or pass through all the phases, except for reading. They study based on their choice and their abilities. There is no fixed entry or exit time. They learn it with their own pace. Language of instruction is dominantly Ge'ez, but Amharic is also used. Dominant teaching and learning methodology is oral instruction and memorization by heart. Peer learning approach is also built in the system. It has 4 modalities. Where there is a church educator in the family, children stay with their parents and learn from family members or relatives. In the second modality, students stay with parents and learn from other educators in a village in the form of apprenticeship. For instance, the children on the picture were supporting their teacher in harvesting vegetable. In the third modality, the students leave their parents and move to other places, churches, monasteries, and build small huts, as in the first picture, and attend their education. The fourth modality is a combination of the three. Traditional church education can be said intergenerational. Marigeta Sahalu, the man on the picture, his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather were all church educators. Even more, his son and 5 of his grandchildren also passed through this education. The traditional church education is also gendered. Females are discouraged for different reasons. Abi will continue from here.
Thank you. Thank you, Dororg. Keeping this in mind, let's come to our question. Are the indigenous and intergenerational learning and modern technology and science in Ethiopia rivals or partners, particularly in the case of church education? Let's start from the partnership. There are evidence of technology being integrated into indigenous educational and literacy practices. For instance, use of mobile phones and apps to read religious books and listen to religious songs, mainly outside church or church schools. For example, Margeta Sahalus, the person in the picture, son who is a priest, and Tarfe, a young woman from Bahar Dar, use their smartphones to read religious books and listen to religious songs. The picture on the right side is a snapshot of a prayer book taken from Tarfe's mobile phone. Although the church educators prefer to preserve the traditional writing system on goat skins with inks made of plants, these days printing machines are accepted and are in wider use. This is another point. Moreover, church educators used to refer to direction of the sun or their shadow to tell the time. Now they have started using wristwatch. As you can see on the picture, Marigeta Sahalu has a wristwatch and he uses it for timing student tasks. Next slide, please. There are also evidences that show rivalry between the two. To begin with, the church educators generally believe that the expansion of formal education comes at the expense of church education. Besides, using ebooks and prayer apps is discouraged in the church during religious services. Instead, the church encourages to read printed books. Tarfe's quotation here, shown on the slide, is a good example. This is because they believe that it will distract others from concentrating on the service. When this is seen against the basic philosophy of the church, which is self-sufficiency and self-reliance, as well as unreliable supply of electricity, discouraging dependency on digital technology makes sense. There is more evidence on the rivalry. The church educators consider formal education as inferior to church education. The man on the picture in the previous slide compared the formal and the church education and cited several limitations of formal schooling. The second quotation on the slide is a good example here. The church educators generally believe that note-taking decreases human memorization potential and develops dependency on technologies, and this affects mastery of certain knowledge or skill. Due to this, church students only learn how to read from their teachers, and it's up to individual learner to learn and practice writing skill. To sum up, religious literacy is one of the informal and intergenerational learning in which families are engaged. Although the traditional church education provides huge opportunity to learn and practice literacy, it has not been given recognition so far. We also learned that where there seemed to be a rivalry between indigenous learning and the modern technology in general, exploring and understanding the reasons behind the tensions or resistance is very important. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have questions, suggestions, please, you are welcome. Over to you, Chris.
Yes, thank you so much, Abby. And I think that gives us a very nuanced take that sometimes more modern literacies could actually be in tension with more kind of traditional literacies. And I think the examples that we've heard today from this different context shows us that there are a lot of learning happening beyond households, and it could be within farming as part of their livelihood, such as the examples in Malaysia and in the Philippines. And what also struck me the findings around these more hidden literacies or learning that may not always be visible in policy and program contexts, but are actually happening, such as those in religious practices in the examples of Nepal. So I would like again to thank all our speakers for sharing just a part of their research. There's more findings in these different research projects, and we have a very good policy synthesis report and country reports that we have shared in the chat box. So again, thank you very much to the speakers, and I'll now hand the floor over to Anna Robinson-Pan for the panel session.
Thank you very much, and to our team for sharing their insights. And I think they took you straight into some of the research sites where we've been looking at family literacy and Indigenous learning. And now we come to the final session of the webinar, and really delighted to welcome you to our panel. Have we got everybody on screen? Maybe Kathy, Thea, and Tuia, could you put your cameras on, please?
Yep.
Great.
There we are.
And your microphones, actually. Brilliant. So this is an unusual slot at the end, but it's an opportunity for our panelists to reflect on the morning's proceedings and the really interesting insights we've had into policy, programs and research during this morning. And I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers. We have Miss Kathy Kell, who is Associate Professor of Language and Literacy Education in the School of Education at the University of Cape Town. We have Ms. Cecilia Soriano, who is also known as Thea, who is the Regional Policy and Advocacy Coordinator of ASPABE, which is the Asian South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education. And finally, but last but not least, we have Antua Sovarano, who is from Mozambique, and she has been the Provincial Director of Education and Culture, Primary Education and Planning and Cooperation, and she's currently National Director of Literacy and Adult Education in Mozambique. So I'd really like to welcome our panelists and for taking up this challenging opportunity to conclude the morning with some of their reflections. And you will see here the questions, which I hope that we'll be able to ask them all three, but we may have to reduce it to two during the time. What I'm going to do is ask each of them one question in turn, and then we'll move on to the next one. So the first question is around what ideas in family literacy and Indigenous learning they can take into their own context. The second one about the research findings, such as we've just heard in the last panel, and how can we actually connect this with policy and practice. And I know in the Q&A, we haven't had time to speak those, but I've been watching some of the questions are around how do we connect policy with this in-depth kind of research. And finally, how can Indigenous learning and family literacy be used in other sectors? Health, agriculture, we've heard some of the connections with climate change too, and environmental issues to achieve different SDGs. So I'm going to begin with the first question, and I'll start with Kathy to ask and then move on to the other panelists. So the first question is really a more general one for all three of you. For what ideas from this event can you take into your own context around family literacy and Indigenous learning? So over to you, Kathy, for a minute or two.
Thanks very much, Anna. I hope I'm clear. Am I clear? Okay,
fine.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this absolutely fascinating session. I want to start off by saying that what struck me is that it seems to me that education systems globally are often plagued by binaries. They're plagued by the concepts of either ors, and that we as the educated, the powerful, the globally connected actually are often portraying these binaries, when in fact ordinary people themselves are actually living much more of a sort of a both and life rather than an either or life. And I think that that has huge implications for the way we think about how we engage as educators. And I think it shows that perhaps we need to think about our own practices much more carefully in relation to what ordinary people are doing. I think some of the key binaries are things like schooled versus Indigenous knowledge and practices. When we look at the studies, we find that people actually live these things together. They actually bring them together and they adapt strategically. Another binary is the idea of languages as bounded static entities, which somebody either has or doesn't have. But in fact, people work with different linguistic repertoires. They translanguage, they often transcript even, they write in different scripts and so on, and they engage in a range of communicative repertoires. A third binary is that literacy is often seen as the most highly valued symbolic and textual mode of communication, whereas we see that, in fact, there are other multimodal repertoires and communication systems involved, as well as the importance of the material objects that people engage with, which are very different forms of engagement than the very symbolic, representational, textual processes that modern education systems try to get young people to engage with. The last key binary is that digital technologies, what we engage with them, either we have them or we don't have them. But in fact, people are engaging with these all the time and they adapt them very strategically to meet their own particular needs. So I think we just need to, we need to be thinking carefully about how we portray binaries, whereas in fact, ordinary people are often doing things very differently. But we mustn't forget the incredible polarization, the growing inequality in the world, the incredible polarization that is happening in the world, the backsliding on democracy and so on, as well as skepticism about science and the flow of fake news. So we do have to situate this kind of celebration of these both and approaches against some of the bigger kind of global issues, which are, I think, very dangerous and damaging.
Great, yeah. Thanks very much, Kathy. We're starting off with some of the big questions there, and I would like to move on now to Cecilia. Are you on? Yeah.
Yes,
fine.
I'm
Thank
here.
You.
Yes, thank you, Anna, and thank you to all the presentations. Very in-depth.
Yeah, so the question really is, what do you take from this event this morning into your own context of ASPA Bay in the Philippines? Thank you.
Well, first of all, we in Asia Pacific, we agree with what Gina said, that family is not only mother, father, but it's really the extended family. And what we take from these discussions and presentations is really that family, intergenerational family literacy and the broader family learning. And it's very important that we develop a different notion or a broader notion of family literacy, which is now very crucial, especially during the pandemic. So we've noted that this is very important to recognize the context responsive pedagogies and curriculum, traditional knowledge, and upholding also different knowledge systems, which we reiterate, these are very important. I also saw several entry points, which I find very useful. So like reading ambassadors, like you start with reading and then all else follow, or use agriculture as an entry point. I think these are very important strategies that lead to family literacy. And lastly, we saw even in the poll that family literacy is not only developing your literacy, writing, reading, but it's also building that community. And therefore, it's important in family learning that we emphasize not only reading, writing, learning. Whenever we advocate, we also focus on promoting social cohesion, promoting economic development, promoting knowledges and enabling people to confront the challenges that they face. Usually when we are doing, advocacy on adult learning and education or literacy, we are asked, what's your evidence? And I think in this, we see evidence is not only data, it's also the stories of transformation, which are very important. And I take this with me when we do our work in ASBE. So thank you so much for all your presentations.
Thank you very much, dear. And I think that's an important point you brought out about community and building community through family literacy, plus the what do we mean by research evidence and this different kind that came through here. Thank you. And now I'd like to pass over to Antia, who is obviously very much engaged with the policy around this, but what do you feel that you took from the presentations this morning and this event?
Thank you, Anne, for this opportunity for us to participate in this very good webinar. And I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the previous presentation, because we have the opportunity to see, to hear about the good experience and the good practice. And what I learned from this is that, we could find with some presentation that the family learning and the local native learning, they are foundation for the learning process. And we found that we have to bring together the parents and the children to learn. And this I learned that we are in the right way, because this experience that was shared by Rukaya regarding the COVID, we also have the same challenge with COVID when the schools were closed, and then we move to reinforce the learning family in the adult literacy program. So in this process, we are also using this bilingual and the monolingual language. And the challenge that we have is that because we have in place 19 languages that are used as a language of instruction. But we believe that this can be heard. And when I heard about the experience of the reads, love for reads, this also
that's the Jordan program, yeah?
Yes, yeah. Yes. This also shows us that this is important, because we also have a national action plan for reading, and we also reinforce the community, and we're taking within the community the readers, as most of the parents are literate. So this also is a good experience and practice that we see and that we can reinforce. So
Thank you. No, and while you're there, I mean, thank you very much for returning us actually to the current situation as well, and COVID, and some of the ideas that we had emphasized through the policy and practice. I think that's really important. Plus the challenges of having 19 languages of instruction. And I think, you know, this really does bring us to the next question, which is how can research findings such as those we've heard today contribute to improving adult literacy policy and practice? And I'd like to ask you, Antia, to sort of set us up on that, because you obviously are fully engaging with these ideas from a policymaker's perspective, and the challenges that we heard at the beginning about scaling up and responding on a large scale to some of these small scale studies. What did you feel about what we've heard from the researchers today?
Actually,
Oh, sorry, I'll stick with Antia and then we'll go to Cecilia. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I also want to acknowledge the presentation with regard to the research, the good and deep research that have been done. And these also, what I learned is that in this process of indigenous learning and native learning, we should take in account the needs of the community, because this is there where the families set the settlement of the families within the community. So, and this also shows that for literacy, adult literacy and family learning, what we should reinforce is to have these knowledges that should be continuous, because this is part of our identity. So I really appreciate the research that have been made in these issues of taking account the identity and to reinforce the values, the attitude, because this will help to grow up the better human being that we have.
Thank you. And I think that's a very strong statement about the importance of holistic education and learning through that we saw through the case studies. Thank you. And Thea, would you like to come in here from an NGO perspective?
Yes, of course. I think we heard, a description of what the programs or initiatives were, what kind of programs were done, and then the outcomes. But in between, we need to see the ecosystem approach to this so that we can transform this into a policy and program proposal to governments, because many marginalized communities, they don't have the resources. And when they speak of resources, they always think of financial. But in this presentation, we heard that there are so many resources in the community, right? So we need to see, what is the mapping of community resources, what are the capacities needed, and what are, the support that we need from the government and from other entities, right? So it's very important to identify this so that the governments can also do policies around this kind of evidences, and not only the usual data that we see, like literacy rate and all of that. These stories are very important to inform policies and programs of governments and also of communities. But we need to see that ecosystem approach there so that we can really identify what are needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thea. And now I'll pass to the researcher, to Kathy. How do you feel that these research findings could inform policy and practice?
Well, I think that I also wanted to come in on COVID, on the COVID situation here and the pandemic, because I think that that education systems are having to change quite dramatically. And I think we're almost not realizing what the implications are quite yet. So, I mean, for us, the positive, I think, in South Africa, and from what I'm seeing from what's been presented today, is that South Africa has not fulfilled its kind of obligations in terms of adult education at all. And in fact, the emphasis is all going into basic education now. But I think what COVID is offering us is an opportunity to re-engage with parents partly through digital technologies, but problematic as they are, but also because materials are going into homes to encourage children and parents to engage together. I know there are a lot of downsides to that, and I'm very aware of them. But I think there are exciting possibilities there, which can enable a kind of a re-engagement. On the other hand, I think we also have to be very aware that what's happening under COVID is what can be seen as what's called a sort of unbundling of education, where a range of new education sites start to become available rather than the sort of the tradition of commitment to education as a public good. And I think we have to be very aware of what's happening there. Just if I've got a few seconds more to overcome some of the binaries that I mentioned earlier are absolutely crucial, to look at these things more, to look at all of these problems, these either-ors in more holistic ways, I think could make a big difference in how we go about this.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And we've actually got a few minutes just to focus on the last question, I'm glad to say. And I'll ask Thea first, shall I? Because you haven't gone first yet. How can Indigenous learning and family literacy be used by other sectors to achieve different SDGs? And any thoughts on this from today's proceedings? Thea, did you want to go first?
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Well, I think I only have one suggestion at the moment because of limited time. One is to bring these discourses and stories to the SDG planning, because all countries, I believe, who have signed on to the SDGs, usually there is a coordinating body, and usually it's the economic body that is coordinating the SDGs. If we can bring these stories and this data to the SDG planning, then we can influence SDG 1, SDG 2, poverty alleviation, hunger, which is, and family, intergenerational family is at the center of achieving all of these SDGs. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. And Tia, I'm aware that you're in a Ministry of Education. Do you think any of this is relevant to your other ministries in Mozambique? What do you see in terms?
Yeah. Thank you. Just to add what Cecilia says, I would say that the SDG 4, you can say that is a cross-cutting. Because we can't have health without education, we don't fight hunger without education. So I think the big challenge that we have now is to bring awareness among all about education for sustainable development. Because if we have this, I think that, and with this adult literacy, then we'll bring the issue of lifelong learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for making those connections. And Kathy, did you want to say anything on the cross-cutting nature of family literacy, Indigenous learning?
I just think that it would be that it's very, very helpful for us to think about literacy provision in relation to the other domains which the SDGs are concerned with, the other domains of practice, and that it might be more useful for us to think about literacy, the old approach of literacy second rather than literacy first, and that literacy comes, that we infuse some of these new ideas about literacy, about a range of languages, about the use of digital technologies into work in other sectors like health, poverty alleviation, and so on. And I think that could, that can be very, very productive. So I think that the lessons that have come up from today can be very, very useful in that regard.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'd really like, I'm getting a lot of comments saying how stimulating this panel is. And I'd really like to thank our speakers for sort of talking, thinking on their feet, which is not easy at the end of a very long morning. But I think you've brought to the fore some of the really key issues and questions that we've been talking about and hearing about in the webinar. So thank you very much. And we look forward to follow-up discussions with you and with our participants today, actually, about how we might take forwards some of this alternative approaches to family literacy and Indigenous learning. So I'll pass over at this point to Rakat, who is going to give a few words to conclude the morning. Rakat, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much. It was indeed very rich panel discussion here, and sorry about not giving enough time for very important questions that were raised during this webinar today. I'd like to thank all our speakers today who were very kind and made available themselves for this interesting webinar that looked into the issues around family, intergenerational literacy and learning, and from the Indigenous learning perspectives. I would like to reiterate the main objectives of today's webinar was about to deepen our understanding of role and potential of this approach, to share knowledge exchange and share our knowledge and experiences from different parts of the world in different types of communities, and reaching or accruing, generating a lot of rich information and learning as well as experiences. I would like, the third one was about to explore the benefits of Indigenous approach to family literacy and intergenerational learning. I think we have achieved, I must say, that responding to these objectives very well by representing different presentations, but from different stakeholders as well, from researchers to policymakers to practitioners. And we are so happy to have very interactive question and answer box as well, where you were engaged to some extent with our speakers and the colleagues from UNESCO and UNESCO Chair Group. And I would like to highlight a few things only. I think one of the important things I would take away, or I hope that all of overview takeaway was that hierarchy of knowledges and divisions into different subsectors of education or sectors of life in society, I think it's rather externally imposed, but when you look into the practice as presented by the program practitioners, by the countries, but also researchers, we see that people, families, and communities, they engage with these fields, social fields, more fluently, more creatively and strategically, depending on their own needs and interests. I think we were also reminded the fact that family literacy, intergenerational learning, is not just about school knowledge. It's not about just school learning. It's about different types of knowledge and the experiences that we have, or wisdom of knowledge that we have within our communities. It's the importance of not rejecting, but recognizing the diversity of knowledges that we have in our communities, and how to bring them back into hardcore or core at the front of such a program as we have discussed today. I would like to also highlight that family learning is a very practical manifestation of lifelong learning, life-wide education. I think with that, I really want to thank everybody who spoke about practice, policy, and research from their different country contexts and community contexts. And I would like to, at the end, to thank everybody, including our partners here, UNESCO Chair for Adult Illiteracy for Social Transformation at the University of East Anglia, and their partners in 4 different countries. And I would like also to thank at the end the colleagues from UNESCO, but also interpreters, for making this very interesting webinar accessible at least in 3 languages. I thank you all, and I hope we will have more of such webinars in the future. And thank you all. Have a good day, and have a good evening for those who are already in the evening in the world. Thank you and goodbye.